So let me give a brief overview of Turkmenistan, which is one of the world's most opaque and authoritarian countries. It's frequently at the bottom of the scale on international assessments of corruption, freedom for journalists, lack of transparency, and other indicators of dictatorial regimes. It's listed as one of Freedom House's worst of the worst. Turkmenistan has no independent media. Civil society is forced to work underground for fear of reprisals, and there is no government transparency of revenues, particularly in the oil and gas sector. According to Transparency International's 2013 Corruption Index, Turkmenistan ranked 168 out of 175 countries. With the exception of Uzbekistan and North Korea, all of the countries with a lower ranking than Turkmenistan are at war. President Berdi Muhamedov is building a cult of personality to rival former President Niyazov's. Turkmenistan's economy is largely based on revenue acquired from oil and gas development, and it's controlled by a small elite who use corruption and personal contacts to secure wealth at the expense of the majority of the population. The absence of a functioning legal framework and the dominance of the hydrocarbon sector over many other areas of the economy and society means that fundamental human rights and environmental protections are absent in the country. Ranked 6th in the world for natural gas reserves, and with what the IMF calls strong economic growth, 30% of the population lives below the poverty level. 90% of Turkmenistan's exports are in the energy sector, and 70% of that goes to China. With tenuous economic ties to the West, Turkmenistan has little incentive to abide by international human rights and environmental standards touted by Europe and the United States. And recent reports that Iran is planning to stop purchasing natural gas from Turkmenistan, along with Russia's and in particular Gazprom's reduced role in the country, means that China is becoming more and more important as a trading partner for Turkmenistan. Galkinish, which was formerly called South Yola 10 field, is one of the largest natural gas fields discovered in the last 10 years, and it's now yielding up to 10 billion cubic meters of gas per year, according to the oil service company Petrofac, which is operating the gas treatment plant at that field. On and offshore oil reserves in the Caspian are being developed by international oil companies, including Dragon, offshore at Chelykan, which is one of the most productive fields in the Turkmen section of the sea. And with the only onshore contract with a Western major being at the Barun field at Nebedag, where Italy's Eni has 100% share in the field. Barun is slated for significant growth, according to Eni, for this year. And the Chinese state oil company and Petronas also hold production sharing agreements with the government of Turkmenistan. So there's significant investment. Oil and gas revenue makes up the lion's share of the Turkmen official government, and yet only 20% of the revenues from oil and gas make it into the state budget. The rest of the money is controlled by the State Agency for Hydrocarbon Development, which is solely managed by the president himself, a relationship that is enshrined in law. How these monies are spent is a question to which there is no real answer, as they are extra budgetary, and as such not subject to any sort of scrutiny if this were even to exist in Turkmenistan. Despite the lack of official evidence of how money is spent, we see enormous construction projects throughout Turkmenistan which support the idea that the money, rather than being spent to benefit schools, hospitals, and the population, are going into the mega projects that we see, such as the construction of the Avaza Resort, which is on the Caspian Sea. And they benefit the president and a very small group of his closest allies. A Turkmen government official told me that oil revenues were being used for the benefit of the population through, for example, the construction of Avaza. So let's turn to environmental protection and look at the record, particularly in the oil and gas sector for Turkmenistan. Generally speaking, Turkmenistan has low environmental marks. A 2012 study by Yale University of Environmental Performance Indicators placed Turkmenistan in the second to last place. Only Iraq was worse. And although Turkmenistan's score has risen since then, it still has a low ranking and has poor marks, but particularly for access to clean water, air pollution around industrial facilities, and high levels of pollution from oil and gas development. Additionally, because oil and gas development is controlled by the Agency for Hydrocarbon Development, it is exempted from many of the environmental requirements that other industrial development must comply with. This means that although Turkmenistan has signed on to a number of international environmental treaties and compacts, including the Aarhus Convention, which requires that the public be informed of and involved in environmental decision-making, and that in the absence of those two things, parties have access to legal recourse, in practice, these requirements are ignored. Turkmenistan has been found in violation of the Aarhus Convention and has been brought before the Aarhus Secretariat for its punitive NGO law, but this has not resulted in any changes inside the country. Recent changes to Turkmenistan's law on environmental impact assessments indicates that public environmental monitoring can only take place in instances where no state or commercial secrets are involved, effectively excluding any oil and gas related activity from the EIA process. Additional complications in the law mean that it contradicts other existing Turkmen legislation, meaning that the responsibility for monitoring again falls back onto the Agency for Hydrocarbon Development. The law on hydrocarbons places all responsibility for environmental monitoring and protection on contractors engaged in oil and gas development, and the companies must report to the Agency for Hydrocarbon Development, not to the Ministry of Environment, or to any other enforcement body, which effectively undermines any authority that they might have. Full control over environmental protection in the oil and gas sector falls squarely on the shoulders of the Agency for Hydrocarbon Development. As research by Crude Accountability and the American Association for the Advancement of Science shows, the agency and the contractors to whom environmental monitoring ostensibly falls have utterly failed in their jobs. In 2012 and 2013, Crude Accountability and the American Association for the Advancement of Science conducted a study of environmental degradation along the Turkmen coast of the Caspian Sea. Due to the complete absence of information about oil and gas development in the Turkmen section of the sea, we wanted to learn about whether it was possible to determine the causes of claims of persistent pollution near the Turkmenbashi port and in the bay around the city of Turkmenbashi. Just south of this area, as you can see on the map, is a nationally protected nature reserve, which also has internationally recognized bird sanctuary and a stopover for migratory birds. We wanted to determine what we could learn about the current state of the environment in that area, and we knew it would be impossible to do this on the ground. So we decided to consider satellite imagery as a possibility. Together with AAAS, we learned that there were consistent sources of oil pollution in the region, both in the sea and in the Turkmenbashi Gulf. Between February 2000 and December 2012, imagery obtained and analyzed by AAAS identified 701 suspected oil spills in the Turkmen section of the Caspian Sea. 147 instances of these were strong oil spill candidates in the region of the sea from Avaza south to Chelakent, including in the Turkmenbashi Bay. And over half of the strong candidates' spill images were of a certain feature which appeared approximately 55 kilometers west-northwest of the Chelakent Peninsula. Other candidates included potential spills in the Turkmenbashi Gulf and in the Turkmenbashi Bay. At times, the spill northwest of Chelakent was as large as 150 square kilometers, which is approximately 60 miles, or the size of Washington, D.C. Not once over the course of the 12-year period we researched did we find any evidence that any information had been published about this oil spill. And interestingly, the source of the spill is located in an area of the sea that is on the border of two oil blocks with active and apparently derelict oil rigs, one operated by Petronas and the other by Dragons. It is located in close proximity to trunk lines, which have the ability to transport oil to the shore, presumably to holding tanks located on Chelakent and then on to Turkmenbashi port. Neither company has taken any responsibility for the leak or responded to any inquiries about it. And Dragon, I might add, received financing from the EBRD in the 1990s, which stipulated that they should be fixing old and degraded oil infrastructure. We also found evidence of spills in the Turkmenbashi Gulf, as these slides show, which directly threatened Turkmenbashi residents and the wildlife reserves just south of Turkmenbashi. Neither the government or the oil companies have publicly talked about any of the risks because of these oil spills. And finally, our research showed evidence of toxic leakage into the Turkmenbashi Gulf from a holding pond collected with a polypropylene factory on the outskirts of Turkmenbashi. Moving on to human rights violations, they take numerous forms. This is a country in which basic civil liberties are violated on a daily basis. Freedom of the press and expression don't exist. Civil society has been forced underground. Non-governmental organizations that existed in the 90s have all disappeared because of punitive legislation in 2003 that required everybody to re-register and then denied all the organizations re-registration, forcing them to work underground. Most civic leaders and human rights activists have been forced to leave the country or imprisoned. Journalists who attempt to report the truth must do so from abroad or risk imprisonment or worse. We've also heard reports that any citizens who interact with foreign oil workers have been subject to harassment and intimidation. According to sources, residents of towns near the oil fields in western Turkmenistan have curfews of 11 p.m. Anyone on the streets after this is arrested and jailed. And local workers have been told, international workers, that if they've been found interacting with local women, they will be fined and deported. But most disturbing, and my final point, is that Turkmenistan is a country with dozens of disappeared people, those who have entered the prison system and simply disappeared with their fates unknown for over a dozen years. Beginning in the early 2000s, the Turkmen government, then led by President Niyazov, instituted a series of waves of repression against its own citizens. Perhaps the most well-known attempt of these was in 2002, when there was an alleged assassination and coup attempt that took place in Ashgabat. Following the alleged events, dozens of individuals were arrested, tortured, sentenced to long terms in prison, some to life, many up to 25 years. They were tortured, tried in speedy show trials until their confessions were televised in prison, and they were sent off to the infamous Abadan Depot, where they disappeared. President Berdimuhamedow inherited these disappeared people. Virtually all of them were put in prison under Niyazov, and Berdimuhamedow could have distanced himself from this decision and from the legacy of Niyazov by pardoning or amnestying the dozens of individuals who were disappeared in that system. In doing so, he could have demonstrated to the world that, in fact, his regime was significantly different from that of his predecessor. He could have changed the world's perception of human rights in Turkmenistan by correcting a wrong from the past, but he chose not to. Instead, he and his government continue the legacy of his predecessor, prolonging the pain for the families of the disappeared and for the disappeared themselves. President Berdimuhamedow has indicated through his actions that his is a regime that will continue to strengthen the legacy left by Niyazov. Environmental degradation continues unchecked in an economy that continues to rely heavily on the oil and gas sector. Rampant human rights violations continue, coupled with unbridled corruption that leaves average citizens poverty-stricken and ignorant of what is going on in the rest of the world. It is clear that any initial hopes for a thaw in this authoritarian rule with the election of Berdimuhamedow were misplaced. He's created his own cult of personality, failed to reform the punitive laws limiting the development of civil society and a free media, and even refused to distance himself from the harsh waves of repression of Niyazov. Furthermore, he has strengthened the legal framework that provides him personally and a small group of close advisors with virtually full control over the revenue from oil and gas. It is this revenue that feeds the engine of repression. It's this revenue that fuels the construction boom that removes ordinary citizens from their homes. And it's this revenue that keeps the security machine well-oiled and functioning. For their part, Western oil and gas companies continue to woo the Turkmen government, hoping for lucrative deals, and European governments continue to believe that creating a natural gas corridor from Turkmenistan across the Caspian Sea will relieve them of their dependence on Russia. These circumstances create an unfavorable situation for environmental protection and for human rights defenders inside the country. As circumstances in the oil and gas sector continue to evolve in Central Asia and the rest of the world, Turkmenistan's reliance on natural gas becomes increasingly problematic. Unrest along the Afghan border, reluctance by Iran to continue purchasing Turkmen gas and oil, and Gazprom's retreat mean that the role of China will only increase. This does not bode well for human rights or for the environment. Thank you.